This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Hornady. They make some of the best, most accurate, dependable ammo on the planet. No matter if you're coyote hunting or plinking steel or hunting big game out west or even going to Africa, they make a bullet or an ammo just for you. Some of the most accurate and dependable ammo on the planet. Also, check out my podcast with Steve Hornady and learn about ammo as well as their story and some funny anecdotes from Steve. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Silencer Central. Silencer Central, thank you for supporting us. If you would like to support Silencer Central, if you have any interest in a silencer, which I encourage because it is a game changer in the field, check out silencercentral.com. They will walk you through the paperwork online as well as they can ship that silencer directly to your doorstep. So check them out and tell them Ike sent you. Hey folks, welcome to Eastmans Hunting Journal Podcast edition. I'm Ike Eastman, your host, and today I have an unbelievably intelligent human being, one of the smartest I've ever been around, Dr. Kevin Monteith, who is not only is he a taxidermist, not only is he a hunter, but he's also a scientist, and he's been studying ungulates, specifically deer, and most recently mule deer, for the better part of 2 decades.
Yeah.
And he's really instrumental in what's happening in these migration corridors and the Wyoming mule deer, Wyoming Range mule deer project, which is what we've been toting for a long time, which is these collared deer on the winter range and what they're doing and how they're surviving. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me and your willingness to share some of this really interesting information about the Wyoming Range specifically. But you have such a vast knowledge of, deer and everything that affects them, and that obviously is really close to my heart. But before we get into that, let's set some groundwork. And you grew up in South Dakota. I just want the people to understand that you came from not much. Yes. and have made it a long ways and done really good things. And that, like I said, again, I can't stress this, he's a taxidermist, he's a hunter, just like you and I. But he comes at this science a little bit different, with a little bit different, end goal, and that is hunter opportunity, along with conservation and management of wildlife. So, where in South Dakota?
Yeah, so I grew up in northeastern corner of South Dakota, close to the North Dakota-Minnesota border, a little town called Bristol, and a town of 500 people. So my high school graduating class was 12.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Didn't grow up with much, but our family, we worked hard. I was running paper routes, had a lawn mowing business, working for local farms and ranchers the moment that I could drive, essentially. Just to help make ends meet. But we also, so to speak, lived off the land at the same time via hunting and fishing. And it's a edge of the Prairie Coteau, Prairie Pothole region, and so some of the best waterfowl hunting in the country, great pheasant hunting as well, and then the annual whitetail deer hunt. And so that was core to our needs at that point in time, and it's part of what helped inspire my love of the outdoors, my love of wildlife. But there's also kind of, as you note, it's sort of a blend of an inquisitive nature, perhaps a desire to learn. But I think a lot of it has just been essential, and I've been inherently drawn to creation since then. In my upbringing, at that point in time, I wasn't pursuing education. Like, I hated school. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't wait to be done with school. Just let me work. Let me go turn wrenches. I was going to go to tech school, be an auto mechanic, and then sort of accidentally fell into the wildlife field. And I was never going to leave South Dakota. That was the other thing too. Like, we didn't travel much. We couldn't afford it. So that's all I knew. And so even the idea of going to college and going to South Dakota State, which admittedly was only like an hour and a half away from where I grew up, but that was way outside of my comfort zone. And the thought was I was just going to go to school to be a game warden, because that's all I knew that there was. And then as time progressed and had the opportunities, working as a technician, working with other grad students, helping collect data, even that started with sifting through coyote feces in a lab to identify what they were eating. And so
boy.
that's where I started, and then it just progressively grew from there to eventually working with deer.
So was there one thing that happened? You're like, you know what? I don't want to turn wrenches. I want to go to school and just see what that's about. Or was it just young and experiment, just trying to experiment with life, and then the doors just kept opening up? Or was it
That's a fantastic question.
one thing?
I truly think there wasn't a point wherein I thought, you know what, I don't want to turn wrenches, because I mean, I still fix my own truck. I change my own oil. Oh yeah, that will never change. That's the redneck side of me that that won't change. And it was more of seeing what opportunity there may be, and my just genuine love and passion for the outdoors and for wildlife. I've been drawn to it my entire life, and beyond that, just how important it was for my family at the same time. And so it was truly a draw, as opposed to I don't want to do that. And to be completely honest, I joke sometimes. I mean, to this day, I go back and turn wrenches, or I can just be a taxidermist. It's fine. And I think that's the side of, the taxidermy side is, again, sort of my connection to nature at the same time, my draw to sort of recreate in those ways. And it allows me to put my hands on something. And so it's I need that side of me to play out at the same time. And I like to think, even to this day, it's sort of that side, sort of hands dirty, wrench turning sort of thought process, which sort of is kind of a cornerstone of our research program as well. I mean,
getting your hands dirty.
Yeah, exactly. Our, part of our motto, advancing science and management, and then one data point at a time. Sometimes it takes a crap load of effort to get that single data point, but some of those data points are key for us understanding and appreciating these animals in a different way. So I often think, whether real or not, I often think that I jokingly say, one of my goals was to bring redneck thinking into the sciences. And maybe that's, part of how you see us and the work we do a little bit different than a lot of things out there. So
yeah, that's one of the things I appreciate is like I said, the end goal is a lot different, but your natural willingness to do the work and the way that you come at it, and you're constantly asking questions like, why do they do that? Why do they do that? And coming from it a little bit different than, well, they do that because, the book says they do that. Well, why?
Yeah.
So you got your master's degree, or you got your undergraduate, your bachelor's degree in South Dakota. You got your master's degree in South Dakota. Were you studying deer with your master's degree as well?
I was, yeah. And so as I was an undergrad and then had opportunities to work as technicians, because I was just trying to gain experience. And it just happened to work out that I was offered a technician position working on whitetail deer, and they were captive whitetail deer. So deer that had been hand raised and we could do experiments on and stuff like that. And then Lowell Schmitz, the PhD student that I was working with at that point in time, left and got a biologist position early. And so that I basically filled that gap. I essentially took over the research program with
as an undergraduate?
As an undergrad, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
That's a door opened.
It was a door opened, absolutely. And that's what sort of brought on not that I'd ever really considered grad school, because I didn't, I'm not that sharp. I work hard, and to think that I could take those next steps to get to that level was never in my mind. There's no way. And then I just sort of brought up the conversation with the professor that oversaw that, and I'm here doing this, I'm working through, and I have these ideas, why don't I just do my master's here? And that led to, basically from then until even when I pursued my PhD thereafter, about 10 years worth of working with those animals, new ideas, gaining, writing proposals to get more money to keep it going. And I worked with, basically helped support and oversee 2 grad students that followed me thereafter, and allowed us to look at many different things with regards to particularly nutrition in whitetail deer, and how nutrition affects growth, which is admittedly that was in part sort of a turning point in me thinking about how important nutrition is for these animals and its sort of long-term effects on individuals and populations.
So that was whitetail, and obviously now you're studying mule deer. Is there a ton of similarities between the two?
There's a lot of similarities, and I think There's nuances with regards to how productive they are, what their diets are, and how they make a living. But some of the fundamental aspects they're both deer. And so some of the fundamental aspects translate very well between the two species. The added layer of mule deer in particular, there's a number of them, but one thing in particular that I believe is fascinating and inspiring and has kind of, helped spawn a bunch of our research ideas as well, is that mule deer some do. A lot of them don't just stay in one place, right? A lot of white-tailed deer stay in one place, or they shift slightly and yard up during the winter, right? It's winter yarding.
Right.
Whereas mule deer occupy these vast landscapes oftentimes that are highly variable, and they move to take advantage of that variation. And so it adds a novel element to that. Though admittedly, from what I learned from white-tailed deer, we've applied, and even what I learned with captive deer and just working within that system, we've applied to concepts associated with mule deer and with free-ranging migratory mule deer. And so it's still led to a foundation to help us ask some of the questions that we have with mule deer.
So back to education, PhD, you didn't do in South Dakota. You went somewhere else.
That's correct. Yep. I got my degree from Idaho State, but my work was all on mule deer in the Sierra Nevadas of California.
Okay.
Yep.
So what was your, I guess, PhD? What was your thesis, or what were you trying to prove?
Yeah. So for my PhD, I had the opportunity to jump in at the tail end of a long-term research project where they'd been monitoring migratory deer and looking at it from a nutritional perspective. And so fairly novel approach to catching animals twice a year, measuring condition, reproduction, and then monitoring reproduction, role of nutrition, role of the environment, role of predators within that system. And so
pretty much everything you're doing now.
Yeah. And then we've just taken it an additional layer. And so science is so incremental. And so even when you look at what we did there and then what we're doing now, it's just been increment after increment after increment of gaining new information, standing on that foundation. And then what's the next piece that's going to help us appreciate things further. And it was in that work in particular that sort of grounded the foundation even further of the importance of nutrition, the importance of body fat for these animals, and then what that means for the capacity of the landscape to support a population. So the ideas of carrying capacity, and then also how we think about role of predation within systems as well. And so it was migratory deer population occupied either side of the Sierra Crest, which that did two things that were fairly convenient in helping understand mule deer big picture. Way more because of the rain shadow, way more moisture on the west side, very, very dry on the east side, so very different nutritional regime.
Yeah, because you think of Nevada versus California.
Exactly. And so way wet on the west side, relatively wet on the west side, dry on the east side, which puts them in a different nutritional playing field depending upon where they migrated to. They all wintered on the east side. But then what we also had is very different predation pressure as well. Very high density bears on the west side, very light pressure from bears on the east side. So basically from that, it yielded this scenario where we had good nutrition on the west side, which should have yielded greater capacity for reproduction, survival, and growth. But bears were largely responsible for why the western component of the migratory segment of that population had declined for the past 2 decades. And so that did not ally with the nutrition that those animals were obtaining compared with the east side. And so the east side were just kind of hanging on, and the west side was declining, but is largely attributed to bear predation that they were experiencing on summer range. Impressive amount of bear predation on falls.
And that's something you don't hear about every day. A scientist going, it's predation.
Predation. Yeah, you don't. And it's the, within that realm. And, I think, I'm a hunter myself. And so our hunter constituents and the folks that we interact with, I often say I may be a scientist, but those are my people, right? And so it's I get it. And it's an easy thing to think that, you have something with canines on the landscape and they're killing some of, our deer that we value having there. So let's get rid of the canines on the landscape so then we have more deer. it's a nice way to think about it, and it's intuitive, right?
Right.
It's not that simple, but it doesn't mean predators never have an effect, right? Nutrition is the foundation, and if they don't have the resources to grow, deer, most animals, they'll put more young on the landscape than the landscape can support. And so if some of those die of malnutrition or some of them go to predation, it doesn't matter. It's when we cross that level beyond that where predation exceeds the capacity of our landscape to support those animals. And that's what was happening in the Sierras. Better nutrition on the west side, but their fawn survival was
horrible.
Abysmal. It was terrible. Yeah. I mean, there were summers it was down in the teens.
Oh my gosh. Because don't they think it's like 25-30% is where you maintain a population, 25-30% fawn?
Essentially. And it varies a bit depending upon what you're seeing with regards to survival of adult females. Like
okay.
We often have, there's markers that we often shoot for of like 60 fawns per 100 does is maybe what we like to see for stability. That's tied to some level of adult female survival, because adult female survival the idea is it's often relatively high and stable, maybe around 90%. But even, as we've seen within the systems we've worked in here in Wyoming to, in the Wyoming range population where we've seen these bad winters, adult female survival isn't always that high. It
Really?
sure can be in normal years, but not always. And so everything is a balance. And that's just like, we often want marker points. We need this, we want this, or we oversimplify and say, well, it's predation. We need to get rid of all the predators. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Easy. Yeah. There's a balance in so many different things. Yeah. So,
and we're kind of getting off track because I didn't know this, but I've always wanted to know, you did a ton of research with predation. I heard a theory. There's a biologist out of Texas that studied this, and I just happened to be sitting next to him at a nonprofit organization, and we got to talking, and he's doing a ton of stuff with coyote predation. And his theory, and he hasn't proven it yet, but his theory is that if you predators are on the landscape for a purpose and a reason, and because their length of life, how long it takes them to decline and increase, if you kill a bunch of them off, they actually reproduce more, and you're creating a bigger problem. It's like a snowball effect.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
So probably what he's talking about specifically is coyotes.
Yep.
And what that's tied to is the idea of density dependence, and then a density dependent response in a population. This concept applies to mule deer, applies to elk, it applies to virtually all animals.
Okay.
Coyotes can be incredibly reproductive. And so if you think about it, when you have a boom of resources, coyote population, just like a deer population, is going to respond and take advantage of those resources, and they're going to grow, right?
Mm-hmm.
One way to create more resources per individual is to reduce the density. So you reduce the density of coyotes, they respond. And yeah, some of the statistics of that are you could probably remove about 40% of a coyote population every year, and it's going to have no change to the population.
You're kidding me.
No, because they just respond in a density dependent manner, right? So we talk about density dependence, and like it's that push down effect of, if you're growing to reach the capacity of your resources, then they're going to respond, they're going to be less reproductive, nutrition is going to decline, those sorts of things, right? But simultaneously, you have a density dependent response. And so when you lower a population relative to the capacity of its habitat, they're going to drive even faster upwards towards that capacity, which is why there's this phrase it's a little bit jargony, sort of technical, but I think it's a good way of thinking about it, that in a density dependent species, which are coyotes, which are deer, which are elk, the harvest determines the surplus, meaning if the harvest dictates what you can potentially yield from a population. And if in instances under density dependence, if you harvest more, you're gaining more in return because the population responds accordingly. Yeah.
And they do that with number of pups or number of young.
Yeah, and just reproductive success as a whole, the same as what we would see with deer as well. Yep. Yeah.
Wow, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
I've never been able to sit down with somebody that would actually talk about predators to that level. If you want to know about predators, you just found out more than I've ever heard anyone say anything about predators.
It's a sticky situation.
It is.
Yeah, for sure.
That's amazing. So, I want to get back to a little bit. We're sitting in Rock Springs at Mule Deer Days.
Yes, sir.
And last night we did a film. It's on YouTube. It's called Imperiled. Now What? And we started with Imperiled in 2019, and that's where I first met you. Is with the Wyoming Range Mule Deer Project, and you guys are collaring deer and you're trapping them twice a year. So you're testing fat in the fall, fat in the spring.
Yep.
Also, you're collaring fawns after they're born. Mm-hmm. You're collaring females and males. Mm-hmm. Which is, I think that's the first time that's really been done to that extent,
to
right?
that level. Yeah, absolutely.
And you guys have been doing it since 2013, so you got a ton of data.
Yes,
a ton of data. In fact, I met one of your data analysts last night, Rebecca, and talked over my head most of the night, which most people do. She's just a wealth of knowledge. What are you guys finding? What are some of the 5 most interesting things that you found because you took this research that you were doing in the Sierra Nevadas and took it one more level with GPS and fat, measuring fat and all that stuff? What are 5 things that you guys have found that hunters would be interested in?
Well, so, man, that's a fantastic question.
Can I only narrow it down to 5?
So many things are just sort of like wrapped up in a story of basically how these animals make a living, and I think. Surface level. I mean, one of the questions we worked to set out kind of initially when we were laying the groundwork for the project was basically how things on a winter landscape and how our presence influence these animals' willingness and ability to use a landscape. And as we've sort of started as well, so many things are a balance, right? And we have needs as humans. Deer have needs as deer. And as a general rule, mule deer don't like our presence on the landscape. And so when we have a presence on a winter range, as an example, whether that be energy extraction or those types of things, we're affecting habitat directly, right? So we're removing energy, well pads, roads, that sort of thing. And so I think we can all acknowledge that we're removing habitat directly in those ways. But what we learned through the course of that is that there's a simultaneous behavioral response because of our presence, and deer avoid those places near to those roads and well pads. And so I think the what's important there in considering that is that their behavioral response leads to leftover food on the landscape. Oh. And so that leftover food in places that get closer to our presence, there's food there that's there, but they're unwilling to use it. And so, I mean, even though we can say, well, there's all this habitat that's here, yes, but unless animals are using it, it's not part of their carrying capacity. So we may have lost this much habitat that we can see, but we in turn lost this much habitat. And the amount that we lose because of that behavioral avoidance on a winter range like that is 4.6 times the amount of direct loss. So
oh my gosh.
If we lose an acre, if we go in and just destroy an acre,
put a well pad up.
Yep, we're actually losing 4.6 times that. Because of an animal's behavioral aversion to use that food. And so we literally we looked at their response via GPS collars, how they use the habitat, and then we literally measured their use of sagebrush on the landscape. And that's how we documented that 4.6 magnitude loss beyond each one direct degree of lost habitat.
So we did another documentary on sage grouse, and we sat down with all the stakeholders, and one of them was the energy industry, and the same habitat that you're talking about in the Wyoming range or the Red Desert winter range is one of the things that we were talking about, because it's a huge sage grouse. I mean, it's the epicenter of the sage grouse, right?
Yep.
One of the things that they did, the energy industry took it upon themselves and minimized their footprint.
Yes.
Instead of 20 well pads, they put 20 wells on one well pad and
used directional
drilling.
That's right.
Which then I mean, obviously you're increasing or decreasing the involvement, the human involvement,
Yes.
and therefore making more habitat for mule deer,
Absolutely right.
antelope, sage grouse, all
Yep.
that stuff.
Yep.
Which is, I mean, that's just responsibility, right?
It is.
Because we all need energy. I drove here in a car. I need it.
100%. And so it's not to say how dare you.
Right.
It's, I think and even as, in our conversations last night, it's not to say how dare you, but it's to acknowledge what it means if we do the things that we do. And if we're willing to accept that that's something that's going to happen, then let's just accept that and do what we have to do rather than deny that it's a thing. I mean, the Mesa in particular, as an example, our measures of habitat loss that's occurred from direct and indirect loss because of deer's aversion to those places is like 45% of that winter range. Perhaps not coincident that that's basically exactly what we've seen in the decline in that population over the couple of decades since it began.
Oh my gosh!
What it also does is it takes and adds another layer of what should be our appreciation for an animal's ability to use a landscape, to access the resources, which scales up to influence the population, which is where, the migration component comes in, which has been central to a lot of our work as well. And, animals in these systems migrate down to winter range, which is a more weather, more environmentally favorable environment. But then they migrate from a whole diverse array of different migratory patterns from short distance to, over 100 miles in the Wyoming range to access those food resources over summer. And even more so than the work in the Sierras with, our ability to handle these animals twice a year and look at their accrual and loss of body fat across the seasons. One of the major drivers within this system, we think about winter. We talked about winter effects. Winter certainly matters. The food they have on their winter range, and we see this play out as well. If the sagebrush, the production is better. If deer density is lower, their survival is higher. But the key thing that dictates whether or not an individual is going to survive a normal winter and even make it through some of the bad winters is how much fat they brought with them into that winter.
Yeah, you talked about that last night, and it blew me away. It never occurred to me that that you can have a mild winter, but if they come in poorly because their summer range doesn't have the groceries because it's a drought or whatever, they can still die. The winter range might be the cause, but it's not what really happened.
That's right.
So what are you finding with that, with the difference in because they travel so much, they're in different high country all the way to low country, all the way to high desert. What are you guys finding with that?
So a few different things. What I think one thing that's really interesting is there's a lot of different ways for deer to make a living, which I think oftentimes it's well, what's the one thing that works and what's the one thing that's best? Right. But the truth is there's many different things that work. And it works to varying degrees depending upon the year. Well, one thing that's been essential, when we've had, and this was before the 22-23 winter, but we had the 16-17, the 18-19 winter, and one of the critical things that we learned through the course of that, and this was some of the work that was, and I should sidestep real quick, all this work within the Wyoming range has been a huge collaborative project, multiple different funders. Wyoming Game and Fish Department's been one of our core partners through the duration, both by way of field work and working with them to address questions, to funding, which initially got us on our path to core nonprofits like Mule Fanatic Foundation has played a pivotal role since the beginning, to Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust, to Knobloch Family Foundations, to Bureau of Land Management. I mean, this certainly isn't, and then I've had an incredible team of grad students from Samantha Dwinell to Taylor Lashard, Ellen Akins to Rebecca Rafferty, that have, and Rhiannon Jacobek, that have come through the ranks and been a part of this project. So, I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't just force the opportunity to acknowledge those pieces, because the only way we can speak to the power of the things we've learned is because of everybody coming together to make this possible. And for as long as we've had, because these winter related aspects, I mean, the project would have, and there were points along the way where it was going to end, so to speak. But
because of funding and
like, oh, we've, addressed these objectives, and then something surprising happens, adenovirus or the bad winter, and then we want to see what recovery looks like and those sorts of things. And it's only in hindsight and then being grateful that you had the opportunity to work through those periods of time to even know, because we can't predict what the future is going to hold.
Right.
And so we're incredibly grateful and like gaining the power of that opportunity to be look over that long period of time. But with some of Taylor Shar's work, because it was coincident with the 16-17, 18-19 winter, the one thing in particular we learned there is that basically if a female deer comes in at 12% body fat into the winter, she's almost invincible.
Really?
She will almost any sort of winter condition, and she's going to have like over 80 plus percent probability of survival.
Does that mean her current fawn is also almost invincible, as well as the one that she's carrying?
So the one that she's carrying will be almost certainly. Deer, interesting, and this is one of those little nuances that we learn along the way. I've often said, like, once a female deer is pregnant and they make it for those first few weeks, they're going to carry it to term.
Really?
Rarely stillborn, rarely experience serious consequences in that way versus other animals like a moose, for example, that will abort along the way if conditions gets too bad. Deer typically don't. But we have seen such severe conditions, such severe levels of malnutrition, that we have seen, high rates of stillborn after those bad winters. So it's only in truly exceptional circumstances where we'll see stillborns and maybe even some abortions
really?
In that way during those periods of time.
I knew moose did that. I just assumed they all did it.
No, deer largely carry to term, and so deer largely carry to term, and then kind of make the decision after that, basically, with regards to those pieces. But yeah, so coming in at 12%, and of course that's all, considering the variable conditions that exist. But if you come in at 12%, you're basically solid. But that relationship is so strong, and when we consider, and I think even our conversations associated with Wyoming range, and especially after the bad winters we have this inherent sort of draw to thinking about the winter range. Well, man, we have all these deer that are dying. We need to do something about winter range. What can we do here? But the thing is beyond the bad winters, the key thing that gets them through even those winters is how much fat they brought with them from summer range, which means, and even answering the question, well, what's more important, summer range or winter range? And truth is, both.
It's an and, not an or.
That's right. You can't answer that question because they both feed on each other. Because an animal, these deer, because of their accrual of fat or loss of fat across seasons, what they're doing, and it's so integral to how they finance, basically how they survive, how they reproduce. They're carrying those resources and those experience with them from one season to the next. And so, yeah, if the population in the Wyoming range didn't migrate, if they stayed on that winter range, we would have a very small fraction of the deer that exists within that system. Because what happens, that migration is key to animals being able to leave there, one, to access better resources, but two, to spread themselves out across that landscape as well. And so by way of moving, while it's a benefit to the individual, when we scale it up to these other places that these animals are using, that behavior is a functional increase of the carrying capacity of that range because they're going there. And that's why some of our biggest, most robust populations are these migratory populations. And that's the core reason why that plays out in that way.
And it also, by them leaving the landscape, it allows the winter range to recuperate during its growing season.
That's
because it has a very short growing season. Because people don't realize that winter range is at 7,000 feet.
Exactly.
I mean, it's high altitude,
and it's those early spring spring moisture, and the sagebrush grows, and that's it. And then they come back down and take advantage of that.
So, so obviously the summer range is very key. Is there being work done that you're aware of to help that? Is there research being done to start figuring out what we can do to the summer range to make that range better. I know last night we talked about fires and the fire suppression. Yep. What does that mean?
Yeah, great question. So I think and especially habitat managers have had appreciation for things that we can do on summer range to make it better, and whether that's dealing with issues of conifer density and encroachment, to fire, to promoting aspen recovery, and those sorts of things. And when we look west-wide and we think about the levels of fire suppression that have occurred over many decades, and when we consider deer to be the forb-eating, browse-eating critter that we know them to be, fire suppression, in many places leads to conifer encroachment, close canopy forest with very little under it. That's good deer food. And so if we consider that happening, big scale across these landscapes, essentially what has developed over time is, while the deer populations are still there, the habitat that they're experiencing has changed. And so we likely can't support the number of deer that we may have had historically given those conditions. And fire can be a great way to reset that. We certainly face a challenge now with the widespread really big fires, because our fire frequency is way out of whack in that way. But some of it is happening, and habitat managers are using it when they can. And what we're doing, one of the things we're digging into right now, Rebecca Rafferty, our PhD student on the project, is leading right now, is looking at those places where we've seen fire within the Wyoming range, and basically looking at the deer that use the fires, looking at deer that live fairly adjacent to where those fires are, so roughly similar environment, but where there hasn't been fire. And then going in, looking at how they use those places, measuring on the ground the vegetation that exists there to characterize the differences between those two areas. And then of course, we have the measures of fawn survival, recruitment, and then fat gain for those females over the summer. So we can hit some of those like marker points of, fire 5 years ago led to this within this habitat and yielded this benefit for animals compared with, what we see otherwise in those areas. So we're working on directly assessing that right now. So we know we have a sense of what that potential benefit is to those animals that live in that landscape.
So I'm gonna talk about another hot button.
Uh-oh.
Here we go. Fire is one way to thin a forest, but so is logging. Is there any data or any research been done on how logging benefits the habitat for deer?
We haven't done that directly. There have been bits and pieces out there, and everything from deer in Alaska to all the way down here. And the thing is, you're absolutely right. What you're doing is you're taking off that canopy, allowing the sunlight to get to the ground, and then fostering recovery of some of those plants that were otherwise choked out, so to speak. And so it's certainly, the outcome is a little bit different than with fire, but it's still pushing in that same direction.
You have to have fire for aspens, obviously.
Right.
I mean, we know that.
Yep.
And aspens are a really key part to unbelievable mule deer habitat. Okay, so the fire is really interesting, and I can't wait to see what she finds.
Me too.
Because that, I think, is unbelievable. But going back to, you said something that's interesting to me. Actually, you've said a lot that's interesting to me. Smokey Bear not only is a predator, he also is negative to the habitat.
Dang Smokey Bear. Yeah.
No, but one of the things you said interesting is that this research project started with this thesis, and because of what you're finding, it's just growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're knowing more and more and more. And more importantly, it's not just knowledge. You guys are being able to take that information and make things that are affecting deer today. We talked about the numbers last night that we were at 4,000 animals on the landscape after 22-23 winter, and it's now over 11,000 because of some of these things. Fire, overpasses on highways, fences, some sagebrush repairing areas, stuff like that. But you said something to me that's really interesting. You said something about the 17-18 winter, and that die off, which was 30%, right? was what kept us from losing all our deer in 22, 23. What in the hell are you talking about?
Yeah,
Killing
right.
deer, saving deer?
What the heck? Yeah, no, I know. So, yeah, and there's an element here, big picture, where I think we as humans, right, more is always better, right?
Yeah.
So keep that concept in mind while we basically tell the story of the Wyoming Range mule deer herd since we began in 2013. And so as we measure body fat seasonally, and we've already spoke briefly about, for us, body fat is something that's essential for the animal to survive and reproduce as it crosses seasons. And we've, highlighted that a bit, especially with regards to winter survival. Body fat is also, here's where I want to say redneck thinking, because we can go in, we can measure habitat, we can do all these different things, but we have to know what is important on the ground already to be able to know what to measure and then be able to understand what that means for the animal. But the animal is influenced by all kinds of different things, right? And oftentimes we can measure the right things, but it's really hard and tricky. And so I often say, maybe I'm just simple-minded, but I cheat and I let the animal integrate its environment for us. And the way it does that is by way of body fat. So all else being equal, an animal that has more and better food is going to be fatter than an animal that has lower quality and less food. So why not use that as the key integrator to what it means for that animal? And so it's incredible power to be able to look backwards to what it experienced and then be able to look forward, because it has groceries on its back that it's taken with it into that next season. There's a lot of power in that. And so what we've seen is we started in 2013, and then we saw as you expect, deer gain fat over the summer, they lose fat over the winter, and we see this cycle. That cycle is important. It's part of the pre-programming how these animals work. But what's more important is what levels they're hitting based on what they're going through. And when we saw them December 2013, and that as we progressed for the following years leading into the 16-17 winter, so in December 2016, we basically started at roughly 11% December 2013, and then each year we just saw this progressive decline to about 7.5% body fat leading into the 16-17 winter. It's not like we were having wild years of fawn recruitment. It's not like the environmental conditions were really poor.
It's not like we were in a giant drought that the high country dried up.
No, it's just okay right. Years, right? But we just incrementally saw that go down each year, which to us, it's hard to paint this picture super strongly, but to us that was in only a few years, but it was a very strong indicator that we were bumping up against the capacity of that habitat. Maybe roughly 35,000 deer, given the landscape conditions, given where deer were living, we were probably bumping up against that. We enter the 16-17 winter. It's a bad winter. We lost 30% of our deer population in the 16-17 winter. And that also what spurred, fortunately, our effort to continue working to see what recovery looks like after a winter like that. We saw amazing bump in body fat after that, a substantial recovery in body fat after the 16-17 winter, certainly the moisture, the reduction in density. And then we already bumped up against the 18-19 winter. So even though our goals were to see what recovery looked like, we bump up against the 18-19 winter again, we lose 30% again. And then
even though the body fat was back to somewhat normal.
That's right, exactly. And so two hits right within that window of time. We saw a little bit of recovery after 16-17 with regards to population growth, with regards to body fat, and then another 30% reduction. And then since then, if you can imagine, each time we go into the 16-17 winter, we begin to what we would call at least breaking records relative to our data run with regards to nutritional condition, how fat they were. We began to break records 16-17. We hit 18-19. We began to break records again with regards to that. And then they largely maintained those higher levels of body fat thereafter. And then as no one could have predicted, then we begin to bump up against the 22-23 winter. When we entered the 22-23 winter in December, we were over 11% body fat. So remember, we were at about 7% body fat going into the 16-17. We were at 11% body fat going into the 22-23 winter. And we knew from all the work that we'd done, some of the work we did with Taylor Lashar, the reason they were fatter there is multifold, but one of the primary reasons they were fatter, we had fewer mouths to feed on the landscape. So that's that density-dependent response, right? We're seeing the improved condition because of that. Moisture plays a big role. So when you get moisture on summer range, and what we've termed the notion of winter PTSD, and that is when these deer have experienced these life-threatening events, we see this like subtle reprogramming in how they allocate resources and body fat through the year.
Really?
Yeah, and so even after we account for all of these environmental conditions like the reduction in density, like moisture, like fawn recruitment and reproductive effort, we still see a signal of if animals have been through a bad winter, we see that signal play out in how much fat they gain through the summer, which seems wild, right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing. If you consider deer in multiple different landscapes, depending upon the productivity, depending upon the severity of the winters, they don't all accrue and lose fat like deer in the Wyoming range. The deer in the Sierra Nevadas do not accrue and lose fat like deer in the Wyoming range do.
It's not so drastic.
Because it's a different system. The summer range is much drier, not near as productive as the Wyoming range, but winter severity almost isn't a thing. Mm-hmm. They can come into winter with not a lot of fat, and they can make it through the winter. What they do need in the Sierra is perhaps a bit more than we need in the Wyoming range, is they need to finish winter at a higher fat level because they need it to invest in reproduction. In the Wyoming range, that level is a bit lower because they're going to places with incredible resources. They need some for sure, but they're going to places with incredible resources. So now if you think about adaptability of an animal over a long period of time, and part of what led us to this idea is some work that they did with semi-domesticated reindeer in Norway, where they took them from like supplementally fed area and then basically reduced their supplemental feed, put them in a nutritionally stressful situation. Females immediately adapted to basically preserving themselves over investment in their young.
Really?
Because of those experiences, because they're coming from that place and they're basically carrying that with them because ultimately they need to survive. Well, if these females don't survive winters, they don't stand a chance.
Right.
So if they're not accruing enough fat, they don't stand a chance. So we're seeing this, it's sort of like the animals adapting to that environment as it changes in those like severely drastic ways. So all those things play into us seeing those animals as 11% going into the 22-23 winter. And then we lost 70% of our adult females through the course of that winter. Super knockdown, drag out, bad winter, right? Had we, based on all of our survival models and the conditions that we experienced, had those animals entered the 22-23 winter at 7% body fat like they did going into the 16-17 winter, we would have survived less than 10% of our population.
Maybe none of them.
Maybe none of them, because there's no way they had the resources to persist through and allow them to persist that long through that bad of a winter, which means that the 16-17, the 18-19, the thwack that it did to population abundance. Remember I said the concept of more is always better. More was not better, especially as we prepared and didn't know it was coming, the 22-23 winter. And so it's those two winters and the hit on the population during those times, the recovery and nutritional condition that we saw, that set them up to be able to do as well as they did going into the 22-23 winter. Now it even gets more remarkable after that, and we still have more to learn. But we again broke records of body condition. So we make our figures of seeing, this fluctuation over time, and we keep having to move the y-axis because their data points don't fit in it anymore.
Really?
Because they're so impressively fat after these windows of time, because they're reaping the benefits of the moisture, they're reaping the benefits of the lower competition on the landscape, and we're seeing these boosts that occur thereafter. And I think what's so incredible, and so now, this summer wasn't the best summer with regards to growth conditions. It dried up very fast. It was pretty dry, and yet our animals were still impressively fat. Some of the fattest we've ever seen them going into this winter. As we finished this winter, and admittedly, we're almost past the winter, but we catch them in mid-March. When we saw our adult females in mid-March, they were at 7% body fat at the end of the winter.
Still?
At the end of the winter at 7% body fat. And remember, we started the 16-17 winter, so coming off a summer range, at 7%. Here we're finishing winter at 7%. There we began winter at 7%. So we're in a completely different situation now because of the bad winters that we've had. And the animals that remain there are robust, they're fat, they have lots of resources to them at this point in time.
Okay, so now I'm going to take it one step, the next step. Because of bad winters, because of 16, 17, and the bad winters created moisture, and it created less, mouths at the table, which created more groceries, more food on the table. And you don't know this, but I'll bet you guys are going to find out, is the reverse possible as well, where these more mild winters aren't going to create the groceries, which then allow, they may be at 7% body fat now, but if they don't get the groceries, the moisture in the summer, it creates the opposite, and where they come in at 8-9% this fall.
Yeah.
Because we had a mild winter.
It's all going to play into that. I mean, precip, whether you consider precip that grows food during the summer or the precip that we get during the winter and how that affects them with regards to winter severity, is a very important driver within this system as well. All these things, and as we often we want to point to the one thing. The thing is, all of these things come into play there and operate accordingly. And I think, one of the other things that we've been working on for quite some time, and this is where as we're sort of like my white-tailed deer world sort of have been able to insert some of the concepts into the mule deer world. One of the things that's in the whitetail world, and it's buried in a master's thesis, but they've used it from a management perspective, is within whitetail deer systems, oftentimes there's a matriarchal female that lives in a place. She produces and rears offspring, and her female offspring reside adjacent to her. And if you consider that happening over multiple years and multiple generations, you end up with these clusters of related females.
The rose petal effect.
And that's the rose petal hypothesis. And so in the whitetail deer world, when they figured that out, what it led them to thinking about is, oftentimes we're not focused on growing whitetail deer. We're focused on trying to reduce the amount of them or reduce the damage that they cause. And so the management implication there was, well, if you want to reduce, agriculture depredation in certain areas, remove the entire rows and you'll create a spot of no deer, because there's no female that lives in that place that's going to repopulate it. So you create a dead zone, right? Well, then I began to think about, a couple different things. We've come to appreciate how important migration is, right? And we need migration and animals' ability to use these vast landscapes to integrate that nutrition. And that's what creates great abundance, right? Well, where does migration come from? We know as adults, these deer are incredibly faithful to their environment. They basically occupy the same summer range, same winter range, and basically walk the same migratory path each year. They're incredibly faithful to it. But then if you think about that, so as an adult, they're very faithful to it, meaning we need to protect those places for their ability to access
corridors.
That's right. But then how did they get that route to become faithful to it? Because to me, that's what's the mechanism that feeds in to determine where animals go and how they migrate. And if you apply the idea, the rose petal hypothesis from whitetail deer, and you think about that here, well, you have the power to extend that to say, well, maybe they're learning it from mom. And whitetail deer, they don't really move that much, and so just right there, but maybe they learn how to migrate and where to go from mom. So that's been something that we've been trying to work on since roughly 2015. But then we had the 16-17 winter, the 18-19 winter, the 22-23 winter. So inherently our research has had to shift to winter and some of those cascading effects. And unfortunately, when we have those bad winters, young animals die, especially. And so what that has meant is it has been very difficult to be able to address those questions, though I see them as being absolutely pivotal to our understanding of migration and how we maintain animals occupying a landscape. And so, because what we need to do is we need mother-daughter, and then we need to see, and we should talk about the buck element of that later.
Yeah, I really wanted to do that, because that's what we all give a shit about.
We have mother-daughter, and so does daughter learn from mom, migrate down to winter range, and then do they migrate back up to summer range, but then what happens thereafter? Meaning we need to follow daughter basically all the way to 3 years of age alongside mom to know what that looks like. So that's a 3-year window of data that we started from day one with the fawn being born, and then follow them all the way through. it's been very hard.
Because your 3 years keeps getting pushed out.
Yeah,
Of these
exactly.
winters.
Because these bad winters are wiping out the young animals. That said, what we are seeing is, from a dozen plus animals ish, the majority of them adopt migratory routes for mom. The vast majority of them end up back on that summer range.
Well, you told there was a little tiny girl that she had to been like 4, asked a question about F10, was it?
F210 was the story.
F210. So tell that story.
Yeah. So F210, F210 was born. I think it was in 2016.
That's the number of her collar.
Her ID number. Yep. She migrates with mom. She migrates with mom down to Winter Range, and it's about 60 miles down to Winter Range over in the Nugget Canyon country. Following spring, she migrates back up with mom, 60 miles back up to their summer range. And then each year, mom's pregnant again, and mom's about to give birth. And probably many people have observed this behavior and think, what in the world is going on? But you see these female deer around spring beating the snots out of these juvenile deer.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, that's mom beating the snots out of last year's fawn that she's been with almost every day. Since that
go
period
find
of time.
your own deal.
Yeah, get out of here. I'm about to give birth, so get out of here. So so F210's birthday was mom rejecting her.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Here's a couple front punches.
Exactly. So with that coincided with F210 taking off. And so remember, Winter Range was south. So they walked south to north to Summer Range. And then F210 ventured off into what is the great unknown. And she then walked over a period of 2 weeks, 60 miles north further, across all kinds of rough country in the mountains. It's not like she just found a drainage and then hooked it and stayed on it. All sorts of rough country through the course of that.
How long?
60 miles over 2 weeks.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
And so we figured when that was happening, she's dispersing. She's going to find her own summer range, right? Because this is, again, we're trying to learn these things and what these animals are doing. What was wild is F210 got to the end of that path, and she turned around. And then over about a 10-day period of time, walked virtually the exact same path all the way back. Now remember, it's not like she just hooked a drainage and just followed the drainage. No, this is she crossed over 22,000 feet in elevation during that 60-mile jaunt out, 60-mile jaunt back. So we're talking up and over mountain peaks, up and across drainages, all sorts of rough country.
She had her own little Ramza.
She did. She did. But what's amazing about that is that tells us that an animal, these deer, could perhaps walk a path once and then have the spatial memory to walk it right back afterwards. And so when we think about how these deer navigate this landscape and be faithful to it, it's because they remember it. That's how they're able to walk that same migratory route year after year. And F210 gave us an incredible glimpse into that and how quickly they can adopt a route like that. So what that means to us is that fawn could walk a route once with mom, and she's got it in her memory bank. So they completely have the capacity to remember. And the majority of them do end up using that same route, heading back up to that same summer range. A select few have abandoned that. We've had animals, a couple that have, wintered on the South Winter Range, that Cokeville, Kemmer country, and then went to Summer Range and then flipped and actually ended up migrating to the Northern Winter Range.
Really?
Which is wild. Yeah.
There's always a black sheep in every family.
Always. Yeah. The rebel deer. I know, right? Yep. Exactly. And so we still have a long ways to go to understand that. But here's the thing, to sort of tie many of these pieces together. If you think about how deer occupy a landscape and the carrying capacity of a landscape, the importance of the nutritional dynamics, the importance of these animals to go to these places to access the resources, the importance of competition, of density dependence, and how that all feeds back in. What gets these animals to these places in the landscape, especially when they're going to summer range, is memory, right? They've been there before, with the exception of maybe the select few that abandon those things. They've been there before. When we have a loss, for example, 70% of our population dying off, if you can imagine, and we have a ways to go, but we have glimmers that are consistent with the rose petal hypothesis. We probably almost certainly lost entire family groups during that bad winter. When you have a 70% loss, I mean, it's inevitable. That's a huge loss. And so if we've lost family groups on the landscape, What that means is we potentially don't have the memory anymore within the population to go to those places on the landscape that were once occupied.
So now it's unused. Now it's unused habitat.
It's unused habitat, or what we've called vacant space. So it's potentially deer habitat, but there's no deer there. And probably many people and many, locals, or you guys, for all the time you've stomped in so much country, you probably have places that may come to mind where, man, I always used to see deer here. I don't see
100%.
any anymore. So here's the thing. There could potentially be many different reasons why you don't see deer anymore in those places, right? But if we just think about everything we stepped through with how deer occupy a landscape, the importance of nutritional dynamics, and how they get to those places on the landscape, if deer aren't using certain places anymore, what that means with respect to the population is when we consider, and this is always like, well, how can we not support more deer? How can density dependence be a thing? Look at this huge landscape. There's all kinds of food here. Well, it's analogous to say we have a 1,000-acre pasture and we're going to run cattle on it. But then let's put a fence through the middle of it, and we're only going to run cattle on the 500 acres. Do those cattle benefit from 1,000 acres, or do they benefit from the 500 acres?
500.
And how is density dependence going to operate within the 500 acres, not the 1,000 acres? Now imagine deer and memory and their intimate ties to the landscape. If we've lost memory to access places on the landscape, it's a functional loss in the carrying capacity of the range, because their ability to use the landscape is so tied to their memory. They're so intimately tied. There's cross-generational ties from one generation to the next, even that ties to the timing with which they reproduce, which is a whole nother story. But what that means is if we don't have animals occupying these places, then it's functionally not a part of their carrying capacity. And I believe that's why it's so important for us to understand this cross-generational process of, one, how the rose petal hypothesis holds, but also, two, the ones that abandon that process and do something different, that are the pioneers. What ones do that? Why do they do that? How successful are they? And are they the ones that can regain us this space that has been potentially lost over time? And I
told my sister, she's the black sheep of the family. I told her, you're really important.
She is important.
She's the one that's regaining landscape.
Exactly. If you imagine unlocking resources, right? And that's what an animal that's going to potentially new places is possibly doing if we've lost out on that over time. And I believe, which this may be pretty bold to say, but now that these are all things about mule deer that we've come to appreciate firmly, really, over the past decade or so, and much of that has been contributed from the Wyoming Range Project and the things that we're doing there. But if we think about big picture, westward declines in mule deer populations, and then oftentimes failed recovery, right? We don't see them get back up to where they once were. And maybe that's part because conditions were perfect, and maybe the densities were actually too high. We had too many deer in those periods of time. But I can't help but think that especially in these scenarios where we just don't have deer using certain places anymore, that's a net loss in the carrying capacity for that population. And, to be able to unlock those resources is potentially a huge return on the populations. But if we don't, they're operating within this new carrying capacity based on how they're occupying the landscape, which is why I think some of these things and the stories we tell, like F210, or we have stories of how certain animals, we have, there's one family group in particular where, so I guess maybe 3 years ago, I went in with Rhiannon Jacobek, one of our team that worked on this project, and we collared twin fawns from a deer that lived in this drainage and did for her whole life. We collared her fawns. We left. We went and did some other work for the rest of the day, and then right at the end of the day, we got an alert from a vid alert from another animal. So these vits cue us into when the animal gives birth, and the vid alert happened to be from an animal that lived in that exact same drainage. And so I told her, like, oh man, let's go. That could be kind of cool. And so we go in there and we collar the single fawn from that animal that lived in the exact same drainage, and it was actually like 300 yards just downslope from where we had just been that morning.
Really?
So they gave birth on the same day.
Really? But
what's more crazy? That animal that gave birth that evening was mom's daughter from 2 years prior.
You're kidding me.
Not kidding at all. And what's wild is that's not an anomaly. It's not the first time we've had that happen. We've had multiple mother-daughter pairs give birth in the same area on the same day.
Well, you know, I hate to say this because I have girls, but you get all their cycles all in the same.
Yeah.
They cycle the exact same. I have 3 women in my house that every 28 days
is that
I hang.
TMI for your audience? Or is that...
No, they probably know this. They probably have daughters too. I go to the shop every 28 days. So before we go into the next step, I want to take a break and thank some of our sponsors that bring this content to you. This episode brought to you by Leupold Optics. The folks at Leupold have been manufacturing top-notch glass for over 100 years. They're a family-owned business just like mine, and that's why I'm so proud to partner with them to bring you these genuine conversations. If you're in the market for a rifle scope, look at the VX5 HD series. The VX5 HD line of scopes are the workhorse for the backcountry hunter. While you're at it, don't forget to check out the Leupold's full line of range-finding binos, regular binos, and their spotting scopes that are second to none and field-tested in some of the hardest conditions on Earth. The Leupold Gold Ring is the gold standard. Not to mention, in an extremely unlikely event that your Leupold glass has a hiccup, Leupold offers a lifetime guarantee that won't let you down. Leupold, be relentless. This episode is brought to you by Browning Firearms. Guys, Browning has been manufacturing rifles since 1878 and is still recognized as a classic, traditional company with a long, proud history. If you fast forward 147 years and they still are continuing to deliver high-quality rifles to the market. The newest addition to the Browning lineup is the Browning X-Bolt 2 rifle. The X-Bolt 2 represents the next generation of award-winning bolt-action rifles from Browning. This new rifle is designed with the concept of total accuracy in mind, featuring elements that work together to help you perform at your best, whether at the range or in the field. New features include the Veritech stock, which provides the adjustability of a chassis-style stock while maintaining the traditional Browning appearance without adding extra weight. Check them out at browning.com. Browning, the best there is. Welcome back. Thank those sponsors, support those sponsors, jump on their website, tell them that I sent you. I appreciate it. Back with Kevin Monteith, we're talking about mule deer. We're talking about habitat. Kevin, one of the questions that was raised last night during the Muley Fanatics movie night, we took a question and answer for, it was an hour. I don't know if you knew that, but it was a whole hour. And we had lots of really educated questions about, about the bad winter, about mule deer, and a lot about bucks. Obviously, that's what we're here for. That's what drives us. One of the questions was, after a bad winter like 22, 23, should we be hunting? Mm-hmm. What does the science say behind that? Yeah.
So there's one side of that that's philosophical, right? And everybody can make their own conclusions and opinions based on that. That said, one of the pushes, and this comes from a place of sincerity and care, right, and wanting to see recovery in our deer population. So I would never take that away from anybody.
It's true conservation.
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt, I'd never take that away from anybody. But I think it's important for us to think about what it means based on our actions to know what the potential return is going to be, whether that be good or bad in either way. And when it comes to, the question of let's shut the season down for 2 years, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the season it's a male harvest. They're polygynous ungulates. And the thing is, in particular for mule deer, we could, which we'll never get to this place, especially in the Wyoming range, but we could see less than 10 bucks per 100 does within that population, right? And we pretty much balanced around 30 or so. I mean, that's with that 30 plus within that population, and we're still roughly 25-ish or so right now. But the point is, we could get that far down, and we would still see the typical 96, 97% pregnancy that we see consistently in adult females.
Even at 10%?
Even at 10 bucks per 100 does, it wouldn't matter. And it's important for us to remember that it's the females. Females get all the credit. The females are driving the population. If we want to see population recovery from the perspective of population growth, it's the females that matter. I'm sorry, but the males don't. We need a small number of them, but they don't actually matter for
so
that.
You could kill 20% of your bucks, and if you didn't do it every year, obviously, you could kill 20% of your bucks, and it wouldn't affect the population growth or shrink.
It functionally wouldn't affect population dynamics. It's growing or it's declining. It doesn't play a role. And in fact, the key density dependent feedbacks that affect a population, it's driven by females. It's not driven by males. They separate through much of the year. The bachelor groups that we see up at high elevation and those moonscapes and stuff like that, they segregate through much of the year. Yes, they share a winter range, so there's certainly some competition there, but most of that is played out with females. So it really comes down to a philosophical question: should we or shouldn't we? And certainly the harvest influences what we see with regards to males on the landscape. What we see with respect to age structure, what we see with regards to the buck-doe ratio, that plays a big role, certainly. When it comes to population recovery, thus population growing back, that part of it doesn't matter. Point being, the decision of whether to or whether not to shouldn't be made on the shoulders of we need this for population recovery, because that's not what it does. It can be made for it can be made for other reasons, certainly.
Genetics and
whatever, not made for the reason of population recovery.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So one of the other questions that related to that was youth hunting and shooting a young deer, a young male deer versus a doe on a youth hunt. And I jumped in there and said I would let the youth hunter shoot the male, because you just told us it doesn't matter. Where it does matter, shooting the doe. That's population growth or shrink. That doe is so important that it's the bucks that's fine. How affected, we talked about nutrition. Now let's tie it back to mule deer bucks. How does that nutrition, how does that fat content work with mule deer bucks? And you mentioned something about does with mule deer bucks in the womb. But how does it? What do the males do? You said females come in with 12%. They're almost invincible. Is that the same for males?
Yeah. No.
Of course not.
Of course not.
We're not as important.
Completely different beasts, and they operate on a completely different nutritional regime that we've probably, we've had glimmers of it in past years, but we're beginning to appreciate it more now, as we should. These are some of the things that are important. But what's fascinating is, as females are going through the summer, one, they're working to support reproduction, to grow and rear fawns. They're also working to gain body fat in preparation for the winter, right? Not to anthropomorphize, but that's what's happening. It's a good way to think about it. Males, they're just hanging with the boys, being lazy, packing on the fat. And then they enter the rut. What's also interesting about the rut, and I didn't mention this last night, but the greatest cost of what causes males to lose fat over the rut, we all think it's because they're running around being crazy and chasing females around, right?
Right.
It's not.
Really?
It's not. You want to guess what it is?
They don't eat.
They don't eat.
I did know that.
Yeah.
So that's why when you kill a buck in the rut, late in the rut, their fat's orange.
Yeah. And so
because they're burning it so fast.
You don't I believe it's that part that ties back to this. When we see males going into the winter, so post rut, they're almost all at 6 to 7% body fat. So on average, every winter, our males are entering winter in poorer condition than our females. Yes, they're typically bigger bodied animals, which gives them some resilience in that way. But they're consistently, and it's almost unvariable, 6 to 7% body fat every year, almost every male going
no
into
matter
the
what
winter.
They come into the rut with.
So that's what's crazy. So, those males, we have males that are certainly coming in, 27% body fat. Some of them are probably 15% body fat. But where do they end up? 6 to 7% body fat, because it's this internal regulation relative to their condition. Females do it too, as we've talked about. Males do it as well. And so, yes, they're going to burn it during the rut because they're not eating. And so how do you think you can regulate your appetite? Based on your condition. So it's this inherent tie back to it that are leading them to that direct state. And if you can imagine, if a male, the so-called male went on all in, he rutted really hard, and he got himself all the way down to 3% body fat before he entered the winter. I mean, that could happen. I've never seen it, and I don't think I ever will, because he's dead if he does that. And so they push it to that 6 to 7% body fat, and it's just the variation among males. Like I don't have a male that just happens to be 15% body fat entering the winter.
Never.
No. They all push it to roughly that mark.
So it's like a switch. They get to 6 to 7% body fat, and they're like, done. I'm not rutting anymore. And that's why you'll see, and I've seen this in Montana, because we can hunt in the rut in Montana, which don't get me started on that, but you'll see these bucks in the early in the season, because I've gone, end of October, 1st of November, and then I've come back at the end of November for whitetail, when the whitetail are rutting, and I'll see that same buck, and he was crazy at the beginning, and he's just sitting around.
Exactly.
Laying around, licking his wounds, watching the younger bucks breed does, actually breeding does, because his switch got flipped.
He's done. He's
wow.
done.
So no matter what, they will go to 6 to 7%, no matter what the conditions are.
That's right. And that's what we see in the Wyoming range.
They need 6 to 7% body fat to survive.
Yep.
So they're not invincible. Do you see
They are not invincible.
So do you see a higher mortality rate in bucks during these 22, 23 winters because of that?
So what was interesting about 22, 23, we lost about 65% of our adult males through that winter.
But still, it's less than the amount of adult
slightly
females.
Less than adult females, and I think part of that is, and we see, and I saw this in the Sierras, like bigger deer tend to be more resilient in the conditions like that. So I think that's part of what's playing out in that scenario, is they're just bigger. But we began losing males before we were losing adult females. And I think that points back to they were just entering, they were burning, if they enter at 7 and our females are entering at 11 and they're all roughly burning fat at that same level, they get down further, and they're working to maintain. And, males were already hitting that point where they didn't have enough to be able to carry through. And I think that's why we were losing them.
So so here's another this winter, we had a really mild winter until, the middle of January, the end of January, and then we got winter. Mm-hmm. Do you think those bucks will put on body fat during that mild first part of the winter and then help them get longer?
Great question. So 2 things play into that. They're down on a winter range now where the diet that they have just isn't what they could experience, for example, up on summer range in the highly digestible, high protein food that they're going to get on summer range. Eating lots of sagebrush and some of the other resources that they can get closer to the ground, some of the grasses and forbs that may exist on winter range as well. But all his plants have senesced too by that stage. So it just isn't the level of quality that's going to help support nutritional gain from the notion of gaining fat. We have seen females, like we've seen females, if they don't enter in a mild winter, if let's say they enter winter around 6% body fat, like not great, but we have a mild winter, and we can see them finish at almost the same place, as in like so they can maintain through the winter, and that's that like internal feedback based on their condition. And in conjunction with that, say, in the same winter, a female entered at 18% body fat. This one stayed at 6 across the winter, right? The one that entered at 18, she's going to finish probably about at 8.
Really? She's going to burn it no matter what?
Yes.
Why work for it when I don't need it?
They have it there to use it. That's what it's there for. But what that tells you, well, if this animal is at 7 and it maintained through the winter, this animal is at 18, surely it can maintain through the winter. Sure, but why?
Yeah, there's no need to.
Exactly. And this is this like internal, everything they do is so influenced by their condition. This animal at 7 has to be functioning different. And this is some of the questions we're working on. Are they functioning different metabolically? Are they feeding at a different level to help support that than the animal that started at 18?
Which also helps the landscape.
That's right.
That animal at 18 is not burning as much groceries on the winter range that other animals could utilize.
Yeah. So great segue. I don't know if you planned this or not.
I did.
You did. Nicely done. Nicely done. So you're absolutely right. And so this is also what's fascinating, right? Imagine, so we see high density of animals on our winter ranges, right? Now, if we just took all those animals and said, we need to have a maintenance diet for all those animals for the entire winter, and then we estimated the food that's there on the landscape, we will almost certainly measure that it's an impossible calculation. We have more animals than the winter range can hold, like especially leading into the bad winters, right? Say before, when we were at 35,000 going into 16, 17.
Mm-hmm.
If we measured all the biomass of the food on the winter range and then determined how many animals we had, we'd say, we're not measuring something right. Something is wrong here. There's no way we can maintain the metabolic needs of these animals through the entire winter. And that's probably true. But that's if we ignore that they brought a crap load of energy with them from summer range. So when you think about migration and its role, part of the reason why that works is they've packed on groceries that they bring with them to winter range, which means
they bring a lunchbox with them.
They do, and which means they need less food on winter range for that animal because it brought resources with them. So guess what that means? We can support more animals on the winter range because they're bringing all the fat down with them. But what it does mean is, just like we talked, everything is a balance. The more animals we pack on that winter range or on a summer range, and then we have that competition in between. And so everything is a balance. And as we talked, competition playing out amongst females, and we're reaping the benefits of that nutritionally since we've had the bad winters with the lower abundance. What that also means, and do you want to talk about bucks for a minute?
Yeah.
Transition to big bucks?
Yeah, constantly.
Yeah, okay, let's do that. Okay, so this emanates from some of my work with white-tailed deer in South Dakota. And we did what's called a common garden experiment. Deer in the Black Hills, so ponderosa pine-dominated forest, used to grow giant deer, like all, records in history. The old bars have these giant whitetails that were shot in the hills. We just don't see them anymore. And they're way smaller antler size and body size than our deer in eastern South Dakota, cropped agriculture. You spent time in that country, good nutrition.
Yeah.
And so the question was, why don't we have them in the Black Hills anymore? Maybe they're just genetically different, right?
Yeah.
And that's often where we go when we think about, we got genetics for big bucks over here and we don't have it over here. So what we did is we captured newborn fawns from the Black Hills. We captured newborn fawns from eastern South Dakota, brought them, these were the captive deer that I spoke of, brought them into that environment, hand-raised them, fed them good food, as much of it as they wanted. And so they were all at a high level of nutrition. We had males and female fawns that we brought in from both places. At adulthood, those males from the Black Hills, they were a fraction of the size of males from eastern South Dakota. Tiny.
Even though they were on the same food regimen.
Even though they were on the exact same...
From their first
From
birth,
day one, from birth, same food regimen. Yeah, exactly.
So that points to genetics.
It points to genetics. It does. Then we allowed our Black Hills animals to breed within that captive environment, so the males and females. We allowed our animals from eastern South Dakota to breed, and then we raised them to adulthood. And what happened, those young males that were born in captivity to the moms that we raised in captivity that were small, to the dads that we raised in captivity that were small, and then those offspring we raised to adulthood, those males made up over 70% of the difference in size that occurred between the original cohort of eastern South Dakota and Black Hills animals. Over 70% of the difference. And
so it's nutrition.
Both in antlers and body size.
So it's got to be nutrition. It's not genetics anymore.
Exactly. It's nutrition. And what it is it's called a negative maternal effect. And it's the nutrition of mom in utero. So remember the animals that we brought from the Black Hills, they experienced the condition of mom and her environment in utero. They brought the Black Hills signature of nutrition with them when we brought them into captivity. That signal stayed with them their whole life. And then it took one, even though they had supreme conditions from day one, as soon as they hit the ground, it didn't matter. That signal, they were marked basically. That signal stuck with them for their whole life. They could have the best genetics in the world. It didn't matter. That signal stayed with them their whole life. Then once those moms were in good condition, in a great nutritional environment, then we saw that huge boom in size. I mean, I have pictures of a 3-year-old male, so not done growing yet, right? Standing next to his 7-year-old father, and that 3-year-old male is dwarfing his father.
Really? Body size and antlers?
Body and antler size. Yeah, his dad looks like a runt standing next to him.
Really?
And it's
holy crap. So let me get, well, go ahead. Now I got lots of questions.
I'll just say one more layer, right? The eastern South Dakota animals, they often just kind of neglect them. We also raised those offspring, that next generation of offspring. There was no difference. They were the exact same size as their fathers.
Okay.
Signaling that they were expressing their potential
That was
nutritionally. That was it. They weren't going to eat. So no change from one generation to the next generation there. Massive change from those Black Hills animals.
Did you do it in reverse?
I wanted to. It would have been amazing to be able to do that in reverse. That was like the next step of we need to flip this to see that, but we never got there.
So, okay. Now let's talk about big bucks. So let me ask you this. So we had a bad winter of 22, 23. Mm-hmm. We had a mild winter of 24, 25. Mm-hmm. Or we're in the middle of a mild winter. Mm-hmm. So these fawns that are in utero right now, mm-hmm. they are going to be signatured, or what do you call it, signaled?
Yep.
To where they have good nutrition. Because these, you told us earlier that these does right now, you guys got done capturing, they're coming out of the winter,
That's
or
right.
almost out of the winter at 12%.
7% out of the winter at 7%. That's right.
Which is that's absolutely insane.
Yeah.
So these fawns that are killed, or they're born in 25, when they're 5, mm-hmm. when they're at mature buck age, mm-hmm. which will be in 2030, they're significantly going to be body size bigger and antler growth size. So you could time, if I had tags and points, you could time when you wanted to put in to maximize trophy size.
To hit the cohorts when conditions and nutrition were right for mom, that's going to lead to that pathway of recovery. And even the ones born this past year, we were in a good condition. We had impressive fawn survival. Those cohorts of animals should be better than average because they should be expressing their genetic potential, because they basically, it's called the silver spoon effect. Mom was able to give them the silver spoon. They got a good start on life. They're on that trajectory to express it. And the flip of that is we have, again, right, we struggle within these bad winters of even fawn surviving, but we had one in particular, and it's actually the sibling to the daughter's story that I told you about that gave birth on the same day as her mom. It's actually her brother, but they were born following the 16-17 winter. Bad winter. Fawn survival was terrible that summer. Their mom was impressive. She amazingly pulled it off, but she carried the mark, and they carried the mark of that bad winter with them. And him as a 3-year-old, he looked like a big yearling.
Really?
Yeah, and admittedly, it's one animal, right? But we've seen it in others as well. But to me, it's like, I mean, of course. He was born after that bad winter. Mom was barely hanging on, and he carried that signature with him through his whole life. And, I mean, he's small to the level of, like, not even just subtly below average, like, runt. I could show you pictures. You'd be like, it's a yearling.
So that's funny. We were hunting, I don't know, 20 years ago, let's say. 20 years ago, we were in Montana. And we see this really nice mule deer buck, but he's by himself. And the hunt winner shoots him, and we walk up, and he's a dwarf. I mean, he looked like a 180 mule deer. Walk up to him, he's 120. Okay. Everything was small. He was like the size of a dog. He was a runt, probably born in a bad winter.
Most likely, yeah, exactly.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
So you could time. Pay attention. You could time your points if it all worked out to maximize antler growth in some of these areas based on the winter that deer was born. Yeah.
And what's interesting is even within all those males, their antler growth, there's certainly signals of, the winter they experienced. We saw a massive downturn in antler growth of all of our males that survived the 22-23 winter. I mean, basically what we saw, if we look at our typical trajectory of growth, is for each year, it's like the males on average are growing antlers that reflected a lower age class. 2-year-olds look like yearlings, 3-year-olds look like 2-year-olds from a size perspective. So there is that plays out, and that was like way, way severe, super bad.
Right.
That said, the nutrition of mom plays far more of a massive role than just like the nuanced environmental conditions that play out from one year to the next. Or if you want to think about genetics or, how to get we want to manipulate things to make things better, or maybe, the desire is to grow bigger bucks. The pathway to doing that is considering nutrition within a population and how we manage it, from habitat to population abundance to all of those pieces.
So do you have data yet? Probably not, because we haven't gone far enough past that winter. Did those bucks come back? Did they skip a generation? or skip an age class?
They pop back because that potential. They don't. Once they're adults like that, they don't carry that mark. That mark comes from maternal condition in utero. That was a hit on them that year, and then
they bounced right back. That's why you're seeing these huge deer on the winter range again.
Yes.
The double or triple drop time that I saw a video of the other day, and the king buck, and
that's right.
You're seeing it.
That
again.
potential was still within them. They just experienced that hit that year and didn't have the resources to invest in growth that year.
Which is funny if you think about it. Those are 5-6-year-old deer. They're 18, 19, the better winner that was in between the two crappy ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's crazy. Well, Kevin, I cannot thank you enough, not only for coming on here, but for what you guys are doing up there, and understanding mule deer and understanding their habitat, and how, most importantly, how we can lessen our effect on them and give them the best chance possible, so that my grandkids and my great grandkids have the opportunity to not only be conservationists, but to hunt this landscape and have those adventures. I appreciate it.
No, absolutely. It's an incredible blessing, and that we're given to be able to do so. And I mean, I get to be here sharing this with you, but there's a whole army of people that are behind this that have made this moment possible, and I should by no means get any of the credit for any of that. There's mountains of partners and resources and collaborators and folks who worked in the field and all my team and that pour into these things to make this possible, and much thanks to all of them to getting us to where we are today to be able to share some of these things. And we still have a ways to go. I hope we can hang on and continue to learn from what we stand on right now and what we're going to see after the 22-23 winter and what it means for this population. Yeah. So it's my pleasure.
It's a ton. Get out there, guys. Donate to Muley Fanatics, Mule Deer Foundation, to your Game and Fish. Even if you're not planning on hunting, buy a tag, because that money goes right to the ground. We're self-funded here in Wyoming. Just make sure that even if you're like, hey, I don't have the money resources, get out there, help a fencing project. Get out there and help plant some sagebrush. Don't donate some time in. Well, I assume you guys use volunteers for stuff.
We do. Yep.
So donate your time. I appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Special thanks to Leupold and Browning Security.
Okay, guys. I want to thank our sponsors from Leupold Optics, Secure It Safes, and Browning Rifles. They're the ones that help us bring this content to you, so that makes you a better hunter in the field, gives you good information, quality contact or quality conversations, and obviously I found some really good tidbits on how and when I'm going to go hunting in the Wyoming range. So thank you guys. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time right here on Eastman's Hunting Podcast.